Hi. All of you will have seen the CAT-23 analysis by now, and you are aware that the CAT-23 Slot 1 VARC Sectional was easier compared to CAT-22 Slot 1 VARC Sectional. What is it that made this sectional easier? I'd like to highlight three things. One is the topic and language of the RCs. Two, the questions of the RCs. And three, the level of difficulty of the VA questions. Of course, selection was most important here. Of the 4 RCs, you'll find that 2 of them were really easy to read with fairly direct questions. The return of the predatory wolves, and the second was the influence of geographic factors on human phenomena. The Indian Ocean passage was a moderate read with some moderate questions, and the most difficult was Salin's essay on the Forager's Way of Life, which was a difficult read with some challenging questions because the options were really close. Of the 4 VA question types, para-summary, para-completion, para-jumble and odd sentence, yes, odd sentence made a return, you would find at least one easy in each type. What I've done here is discuss the RCs in great detail using the IMS 5-pause approach so that you have a systematic understanding of the RC, the development of thought there, the question and option elimination. Of course, you will take far less time while solving the RC. With each of the VA questions too, I followed a systematic approach that is believed to reduce inaccuracy. Please do solve the paper before you watch this video. For all the CAT-23 students, I hope this gives you a retrospect analysis. For all our CAT-24 and future aspirants, I hope this video helps you in your preparation. This passage is to do with post-colonial literature, and the first paragraph tells us that usually the world of the novel for post-colonial literature, particularly early ones, was often the nation. They were usually concerned with national questions. Sometimes the whole novel, the entire story was more like a metaphor of the nation. And that was important at those times for supporting anti-colonial nationalism. But it could also be limiting, focused inward on the land alone. Now, from our understanding of this paragraph, the topic appears to be post-colonial literature. But we know that the next paragraph onwards, the focus shifts to post-colonial literature with specific reference to the Indian Ocean or Indian Ocean writings. We'll keep the topic as of now as post-colonial literature. What is the argument here? That for early post-colonial novels, their world revolved around nations and national questions to support anti-colonial nationalism. But this could be limiting, land-focused and inward-looking. Let's look at the next paragraph. The new book of this author, Writing Ocean Worlds, explores another kind of world, which is not that of the village or nation, but that of the Indian Ocean world. The book describes a set of novels in which Indian Ocean is the center of the story. And the writings or the novels are those of Amitav Ghosh, Abdul Razak Gurnah, Lindsay Collin, and Joseph Conrad. Their work reveals a world that is outward-looking, full of movement, border crossing, and south-south interconnection. They're all very different. From colonially inclined to radically anti-capitalist, but together, when you put them all together, so each writer has his own biases, his own ideas, but when you put them all together and they draw on and shape a wider sense of the Indian Ocean space through their themes, images, metaphors, and language. That completely has the effect of remapping the world in the reader's mind. It makes the reader imagine the Indian Ocean as centered in the interconnected global south. So, Writing Ocean Worlds is a book that puts together a set of novels by different writers to discuss things about the Indian Ocean, which is novels and stories that are outward looking, full of movement, etc., etc. And totally it has the effect of remapping the world in the reader's mind with the focus of Indian Ocean as the center of the interconnected global south. So, the book Writing Ocean Worlds explores the world of the Indian Ocean in the writings of Amitav Ghosh, Abdul Razak Gurnah, Lindsay Collin, and Joseph Conrad, all of which is outward-looking, border-crossing, south-south interconnection, and remaps the world in the reader's mind as centered in the interconnected global south. Let's look at the next paragraph. The Indian Ocean world is a term that's used to describe the long-lasting connections among the coasts of East Africa, the Arab coast, South and East Asia. These coasts are not very near, but there are long-lasting connections among these coasts, and these connections were made possible by the geography of the Indian Ocean. For much of history, travel was easier by sea than by land. So the port cities very far apart from each other, often more easily connected than to the closer inland cities. So it was easier for you to establish connections with port cities far away because travel by sea was easier. Historical and archaeological evidence suggests that what we now call globalization first appeared in the Indian Ocean. This is the interconnected oceanic world referenced and produced by the novels in my book. Now, this exactly is what the author highlights, that his book talks about the connections among the coasts of East Africa, Arab coast, South and East Asia, which were far away but were easier to get connected to thanks to the easy sea travel. Now this is more like, globalization that first appeared in the Indian Ocean. So let's put this together. The Indian Ocean world describes the long-lasting connections among these coasts, and that was made possible by the geography of the Indian Ocean, and evidence suggests that globalization first appeared in the Indian Ocean. Let's look at how this is taken ahead. For their part, Ghosh, Gurna, Colin and even Conrad reference a different set of theories and geographies than the ones most commonly found in fiction in English. Now, why is the writings of these writers different? The author says that their writings that revolve around the Indian Ocean do not reference the same set of histories and geographies that any other English fiction writer takes or uses. They reference a different set of histories and geographies, which means their perspective is very different. The common English fiction are mostly centered in Europe or the US, assume a background of Christianity and whiteness, and mention places like Paris and New York. But the novels in the author's book highlight a largely Islamic space, feature characters of color, and centralize the ports of Malindi, Mombasa, Aden, Java, and Bombay. It's a densely imagined, richly sensory image of a southern cosmopolitan culture, which provides for an enlarged sense of place in the world. Now, because they are not looking at things from the same historical and geographical viewpoint as other English novelists, they end up creating a different picture of the Indian Ocean. For instance, the author says that in his book, the highlight is a largely Islamic space, unlike the usual Christian background that a lot of English novels have. This feature characters of color, meaning not just the white man, but other colors too. Centralize ports that are not commonly part of the Western world. So, what's the argument? Ghosh, Gurna, Colin and Conrad's novels create a rich image of a southern cosmopolitan culture, which provides for an enlarged sense of place in the world and are different from the histories and geographies of other English fiction. Let's look at what comes next. Para 5. This remapping is particularly powerful for the representation of Africa. So the entire remapping, presenting the happenings of the Indian Ocean in a different perspective, is particularly important for how Africa is represented. Because in the fiction, in the stories, all characters are not European. You find that there are African, Indian, Arab traders, and they are playing multiple roles as traders, as captains, as runaways, etc. That doesn't mean that Indian Ocean Africa is romanticized. It's not a romantic picture. There is a lot of reality too. Migration is a matter of force. Travel is portrayed as abandonment rather than adventure. Freedoms are kept from women and slavery is seen quite a bit. It's rife. What it means is that the African part of the Indian Ocean world plays an active role in its long, rich history and therefore in that of the wider world. So, our argument here can be put as the remapping particularly represents Africa differently, with African, Indian and Arab characters playing different roles, highlighting the active role of the African part of the Indian Ocean in its and the world's history. Let's look at putting all of this together and drawing our main idea. Now, It starts with early post-colonial novels that were inward-looking and focused just on nations and national questions, because their entire effort was to support anti-colonial nationalism. But the book of this author, which is titled Writing Ocean Worlds, gets into the novels of 4 other novelists. And all these novelists have written stories which are outward-looking, border-crossing, South-South connection. They establish the South-South interconnection, and they remap the world in the reader's mind. What do they explore? They all explore the world of the Indian Ocean and the happenings there. The Indian Ocean world describes the long-lasting connections among the coasts of East Africa, Arab coast, South and East Asia. This happened, or this was made easy by the geography of the Indian Ocean. And evidence tells us that globalization first appeared in the Indian Ocean. It didn't happen in the Western world. These novelists, the stories of these novelists, they create a different image of a southern cosmopolitan culture, because they look at things from a different history and different geographies. So they create a rich image of a southern cosmopolitan culture, and that provides for an enlarged sense of place in the world. The remapping particularly represents Africa differently, with African, Indian and Arab characters playing different roles, highlighting the active role of the African part of the Indian Ocean in world history and in the history of the Indian Ocean. So, when you put all this together, you know that the focus here is on the writings, novels that wrote about the Indian Ocean and wrote about it from a different perspective. They imagined it and understood it differently, not from the history and geography that the Westerners usually consider, but from a different perspective. Let's put our main idea this way. Unlike early post-colonial novels, Writing Ocean Worlds explores the world of the Indian Ocean through the writings of Ghosh, Gurna, Colin and Conrad, highlights the connections amongst the coasts of East Africa, Arab coast, South and East Asia, remaps the world in the reader's mind as centered in the interconnected global South, and creates a rich image of a southern cosmopolitan culture and its role in world history. We could perhaps even consider the idea of how they look at things differently and not the usual histories and geographies of other English fiction. Let's look at our first question now. All of the following statements, if true, would weaken the passage's claim about the relationship between mainstream English language fiction and Indian Ocean novels, except. So, there are 3 options that would weaken the passage's claim about the relationship between English language fiction and Indian Ocean novels, these 2 sets of novels, except there is one that wouldn't weaken, which means that might be a fact that we are able to see in the passage. Let's look at option 1. Most mainstream English language novels have historically privileged the Christian white male experience of travel and adventure. They have indeed, which means this can very well be our exception. Go back to para 4. We are talking about the commonly found English novels are mostly centered in Europe or the US. They assume a background of Christianity and whiteness and mention places like Paris and New York. That means this is not contradictory to what the author mentions or what the author presents as the relationship between mainstream English language fiction and Indian Ocean novels. So let's hold this. This might be our exception. The depiction of Africa in most Indian Ocean novels is driven by an Orientalist imagination of its cultural crudeness. Now understand what we mean by Orientalist imagination. The Oriental imagination is the Westerner's perception or imagination of the East, the culture of the East, the people of the East. That obviously is a comparison that the Westerner makes with his own culture. He contrasts the Eastern culture with his own culture as the standard, and therefore views the Eastern culture as substandard and crude. Now, that is not what the fact is here. The author says that these 4 writers, they reference a different set of histories and geographies than the ones most commonly found in fiction in English. The common fiction in English, or usually the fiction in English, reference a Western set of history and geography. They look at the world from the Western perception. But these writers don't do that. They look at the world from a different viewpoint. So, this could weaken the relationship. It is contradictory to what the author says. Let's look at option 3. Very few mainstream English language novels have historically been set in American and European metropolitan cities. Very few mainstream English novels? Not really. If you go back to the same detail from para 4, you know that the commonly found English novels are mostly centered in Europe and mention places like Paris and New York. So this is contradictory to what the author mentions and can weaken the relationship between the two sets of novels. 4. The depiction of Africa in most Indian Ocean novels is driven by a post-colonial nostalgia for an idyllic past. The way in which Africa is presented is driven by a post-colonial yearning for a past that was ideal. Now, two things that we will consider here is that, 1, the way in which Indian Ocean is presented and Africa is presented in these Indian Ocean writings is that it's an image of a southern cosmopolitan culture. It remaps the world in the reader's mind. It creates the Indian Ocean as centered in the interconnected global south. It is almost as if globalization first appeared in the Indian Ocean. Now consider all of these things and the fact that these writers looked at everything, the Indian Ocean and its history, from a different point of view, not from the usual Western point of view. That means that we are not driven by a post-colonial nostalgia for an idyllic past or an ideal past. It is trying to remap and present a different picture of Africa and the Indian Ocean in the reader's mind. So this is also contradictory to the image or idea created by the author and therefore can weaken the passage's claim about the relationship between these two sets of novels. So our answer ends up being option 1 because this does not contradict the relationship. It states a fact that the author agrees with. Therefore, 1 is our answer. Which one of the following statements is not true about migration in the Indian Ocean world? 1. Migration in the Indian Ocean world was an ambivalent experience. Was it? Migration is often a matter of force. Travel is portrayed as abandonment rather than adventure. Was it ambivalent? Yes, because the previous part talks about a slightly romanticized picture, but the author goes on to say that no, everything is not really romanticized. Migration is often a matter of force. This is what is given in the 5th para. You can go back to refer to that. So this is a true statement. Geographical location rather than geographical proximity determined the choice of destination for migrants. Is this true? Yes. Go back to para 3. For much of history, travel by sea was easier than travel by land. So the port cities far apart were more easily connected to each other than to closer inland cities. So this is also true. Option 3. The Indian Ocean world's migration networks were shaped by religious and commercial histories of the region. Is this true? Yes. Go back to para 4. The novels in my book, the author says, highlight instead a largely Islamic space, feature characters of color, centralize the ports of Malindi, Mombasa, Aden, Java and Bombay. So, is this true? Yes, this is a true statement. Option 4. The Indian Ocean world's migration networks connected the global south, global north with the global south. Now, is this true? No. It starts from the early paragraph onwards where it talks about the south-south connectedness. Look at what para 2 also says. This has the effect of remapping the world in the reader's mind as centered in the interconnected global south. It has nothing to do with connecting the north and the south. So 4 is not true about migration in the Indian Ocean world. We will only consider options 1, 2 and 3 as true and 4 as not true. That means this is our answer. All of the following claims contribute to the remapping discussed in the passage except the remapping that is discussed except. So what are the aspects that support the idea of remapping? Remember, the whole idea of the Indian Ocean was remapped in the reader's mind, giving it a lot of importance. Let's look at option 1. The global south as opposed to the global north was the first center of globalization. Historical and archaeological evidence suggests that what we now call globalization first appeared in the Indian Ocean. So that means that the global south was the first center of globalization. That is not our answer, it's not an exception. It contributes to the remapping. Indian Ocean novels have gone beyond the specifics of national concerns to explore rich regional pasts. Yes, this is what Para 2 talks about. My new book, Writing Ocean Worlds, explores another kind of world of the novel, not the village or the nation, but the Indian Ocean world. Cosmopolitanism originated in the West and traveled to the East through globalization. We are not told at any point in the passage that cosmopolitanism originated in the West. We do know that globalization first appeared in the Indian Ocean. We also know that the picture that is created by Writing Ocean Worlds is a densely imagined, richly sensory image of a southern cosmopolitan culture which provides for an enlarged sense of place in the world. That does not mean that cosmopolitanism began in the West. Globalization first appeared in the Indian Ocean. So through globalization, you can't say cosmopolitanism came in. Cosmopolitan culture is what is seen as part of the Indian Ocean. The world of early international trade and commerce was not the sole domain of white Europeans, clearly said in Para 5, where in the fiction, sailors and travelers are not all European. There are all sorts of people, Africans, Indians, Arab characters that play different roles. 4 is part of remapping. 1 and 2 are also part of the remapping. 3 cannot be part of the remapping because it does not present the South in a novel way or a different way. It ends up reinforcing an idea that has always existed in the West, that cosmopolitan and everything new originated in the West and then came to the East. So we will consider 3 as our exception. On the basis of the nature of the relationship between the items in each pair, choose the odd pair out. Now, what's the first one? Indian Ocean world and slavery. Are they related in some way? Yes. If you look at Para 5, he does say that doesn't mean that everything about the Indian Ocean, Africa is romanticized. Because yes, slavery is seen to be rife there, present a lot. So can this be a pair? Yes, Indian Ocean world does have slavery too. Post-colonial novels are border crossing. Now the post-colonial novels that is given in the first para are said to be limiting, land-focused and inward-looking. So can they be taken as border crossing? Perhaps not. Let's look at the next one. Post-colonial novels, anti-colonial nationalism. The focus of post-colonial novels was the nation and national questions because they had to support anti-colonial nationalism. So is that a pair? Yes, 3 can be considered to be 2 terms that sync with each other. 4. Indian Ocean novels outward looking. Are the Indian Ocean novels seen to be outward looking? Yes. Examine Para 2, that will tell you so. That means option 1 is correct for us. Option 3 is correct for us. Option 4 is also correct. But there is no association of post-colonial novels and border crossing. They are not. They are inward looking and land focused. So this will be the odd pair out. This is one of the easier passages and talks about how there are 2 types of factors, geographic and non-geographic, that influence many human phenomena and characteristics such as behaviors, beliefs, economies, genes, incomes, life expectancies and other things. The geographical factors are the physical and biological factors like climate, geographic location, the distributions of wild plant and animal species, soils, topography, etc. The non-geographic factors include those that can be called culture and those that can be put under history, subsumed or put under history, and decisions by individual people. So our topic clearly is geographic and non-geographic factors that influence human phenomena and characteristics. What is the argument that this paragraph seeks to make? Human phenomena and characteristics are influenced by geographic factors that are physical and biological, and non-geographic factors such as culture, history, and individual decision making. Now, what does Para 2 talk about? It goes on to explain this difference between geographic factors that impact human phenomena and non-geographic factors. The differences between the current economies of North and South Korea cannot be attributed to the modest environmental differences between them. They are instead due entirely to the different government policies. So here is an example of a non-geographic factor. At the opposite extreme, he says, the Inuit and other traditional peoples living north of the Arctic Circle developed warm fur clothes but no agriculture, whereas people around the equatorial lowland, they never developed warm fur clothes but often developed agriculture. Now the explanation here is clearly geographic. It has nothing to do with cultural or historical factors unrelated to geography. Likewise, Aboriginal Australia. It remained the sole continent occupied by hunter-gatherers or the foragers and had no native farming or herding. Now, here the explanation is again biogeographic. What does this mean? The Australian continent has no domesticable native animal species and very few native plant species that can be domesticated or grown, extensively grown and developed. Instead, the crops and domestic animals that now make Australia a food and wool exporter are all non-native, mainly Eurasian species such as sheep, wheat, grapes brought to Australia by overseas colonists. Now, the third example is again that of biogeography. So, what is the argument here? The author goes on to give examples of what he stated earlier, that you can have examples that are exclusively non-geographic, whereas you can also have examples that are entirely geographic, as is Aboriginal Australia, which is biogeographic, which has a biogeographic explanation. Now, let's take this ahead. Today, no scholar would be silly enough to deny that culture, history, and individual choices play a big role in many human phenomena. They'd all accept it very easily. Scholars don't react to cultural, historical, and individual agent explanations by denouncing, criticizing, or rejecting cultural determinism, historical determinism, or individual determinism, and then thinking no further. That is, when it comes to these other factors, non-geographical factors like culture, history, individual choices, scholars don't criticize and reject using cultural determinism, historical determinism, etc. But many scholars do react to any explanation invoking geographic role in human phenomena. By criticizing geographic determinism, they say you cannot use this. They say that this cannot influence human behavior. So the argument is, scholars do not deny the role of non-geographical factors in many human phenomena, but many react to any reference to a geographic role by denouncing geographic determinism. How does para 4 take this ahead? Now the author goes on to elaborate why there is this widespread but nonsensical view, pretty strong coming from the author. He really is unhappy about this viewpoint regarding geographical factors that influence. One reason is that some geographical explanations advanced a century ago were racist. So, all geographic explanations have become tainted by racist associations in the minds of many scholars other than geographers. So what was mentioned or given some time back, a century ago, was racist. Now all geographic explanations have become tainted with this, are marred by this idea of racism. But many genetic, historical, psychological, and anthropological explanations advanced a century ago were also racist. Yet the validity of newer non-racist genetic explanations is widely accepted today. So there are many other explanations of other disciplines that are also racist. They were brought up some time back and they were racist. Today, there are newer explanations created for them which are non-racist and are accepted. For example, there are newer non-racist genetic explanations created today which are widely accepted. So what's the argument here? One reason is that some geographical explanations given a century ago were racist, thus tainting all geographical explanations. But there are many genetic, historical, psychological, and anthropological explanations that were racist, yet newer non-racist explanations are accepted, especially in the case of the genetic explanations. Para 5. Yet another reason for reflex rejection, complete rejection of geographic explanation is that historians have a tradition in their discipline of stressing the role of contingency based on individual decisions and chance. Contingency, a factor that you fall back on, a decision made dependent on many things. So this decision, that is an individual's decision depending on many factors. Historians have a tradition of stressing the role of contingency in their discipline. That view is warranted quite in many cases, but often that view is also unwarranted. Look at the example given here. He says the development of warm fur clothes among the Inuit living north of the Arctic Circle was not because one influential Inuit leader persuaded other Inuit in 1783 to adopt warm fur clothes for no good environmental reason. It is not because someone convinced them to wear warm clothes, fur clothes. It was more to do with a geographical reason and environmental reason that they had to adopt this. So, this is an example that he gives to prove how historians depend too much on the idea of contingency or individual decision making. Now, what is our para 6 all about? A third reason is that geographic explanations usually depend on detailed technical facts of geography and other fields of scholarship. Most historians and economists don't acquire that detailed knowledge as part of the professional training. Now, what is this telling us? That as part of their professional training, they don't get a detailed knowledge of geography. And a lot of geographic explanations depend on detailed technical facts, which they cannot understand because they have not been trained to understand that. Now, this is another reason why people reject geographical explanations. Let's put all of this together and look at what our main idea can be. The flow of thought is fairly structured here. So, what we start with is that there are two types of factors that influence human phenomena and characteristics: the geographic factors, which are physical and biological, and the non-geographic factors. Then the author goes on to give us examples of something that is exclusively geographic, exclusively non-geographic, and something that is biogeographical, which again ends up being a geographical factor. But what he says later is that people don't reject the role played by non-geographical factors in creating human phenomena, in many human phenomena. But they do react whenever you mention a geographical explanation, and they use this idea of geographic determinism to reject all of it, to criticize. What could be the reasons? Now the author elaborates that. The reasons are: 1, what was given as a geographical explanation a century ago was racist, and that continues to be because it affects all the other explanations given later in the minds of all people, in the minds of all scholars who are also, non-geographers. In the minds of all these scholars, this idea continues to be that they are all racist explanations. But then in other fields also, we've had racist explanations given earlier, but now they are being revised, and the revised explanations are being accepted. The second reason he says that historians give too much importance to the role of contingency, that is individual decision making. And finally, they don't really have the kind of knowledge of geography that is expected so that they understand the explanations given. And that is one more reason why they reject. So let's put it all together. Though human phenomena and characteristics are influenced by geographic and non-geographic factors, many scholars reject the role of geographic factors due to reasons such as racist geographical explanations, unwarranted importance of contingency in history, and lack of technical geographic knowledge. Let's now look at the questions. The examples of the Inuit and Aboriginal Australians are offered in the passage to show. Now, this is once again a question that asks you what is the role played by this example? What is the point the author is trying to give with this example? It will always have to be understood in the larger context of the passage. Never can you not keep the main idea in mind. We know what the main idea is. The author is trying to talk about the role played by geographic factors also in human phenomena and characteristics, though that is rejected by a lot of other scholars. Now, let's look at the examples. We have first, human resourcefulness across cultures in adapting to their surroundings. Is this the point that he's making with these two examples? So, in para 2, he starts with the examples of the North and South Korean economies and talks about they are not determined by their geographical factors, but that is purely an economic decision made by economic policies. So, after that, he begins to talk about at the opposite extreme, you have the Inuit and the other traditional people. They develop a certain lifestyle or wear some sort of clothes, and that explanation is straightforwardly geographic. So, is this example meant to talk about human resourcefulness across cultures in adapting to their surroundings, or is this an example for what can be a purely geographical influence on human behavior and human phenomena? So, 1 is not really the point here. 2, that despite geographical isolation, traditional societies were self-sufficient and adaptive. There is no discussion here about geographical isolation. That's not the point that the author is talking about. 3, how environmental factors lead to comparatively divergent paths in livelihoods and development. The point of the passage is not about divergent paths in livelihoods and development, and how environmental factors lead to this divergent paths. The examples given here and the point of the author is that there are certain phenomena and certain behavior of humans that are influenced purely by geographic factors. So, is that what 4 talks about? How physical circumstances can dictate human behavior and cultures. The physical circumstances is the environment or geography. Environment doesn't lead to divergent paths, but physical circumstances or environment or geography determines and can dictate human behavior and cultures. Clearly, that's the example. So is the example of the Aboriginal Australians given here for the same reason. The explanation, he says, is biogeographic. Now, what best captures the point here is option 4, not even 3, because 3 talks about divergent paths. It's not about that. It's the influence of geographic factors, which makes 4 our correct answer. The author criticizes scholars who are not geographers for all of the following reasons, except, let's look at the options. The importance they place on the role of individual decisions when studying human phenomena. Does he criticize scholars for the heavy importance they give to contingency? Yes, he does that. That's given in para 5. He says that why geographic explanations are rejected by historians is because they have a heavy role given to contingency, which is individual decision making. But that's an unwarranted one. So that's a criticism. So 1 cannot be our exception here. 2, their labeling of geographic explanations as deterministic. Do they call geographic explanation as geographic determinism? Yes, they do. Does the author criticize them for it? Yes, he does. Para 3, many scholars do react to any explanation invoking geographic role by denouncing geographic determinism. So that is a criticism that therefore 2 cannot be our answer. Look at 3. They are outdated interpretations of past cultural and historical phenomena. Now, that scholars interpret past cultural and historical phenomena in a slightly outdated manner is referred to. But the author does not use this to criticize them for not accepting geographical explanations. So para 4 does make a reference to how there were explanations like genetic, historical, psychological, anthropological that were given a century ago, and they were racist. Yet people accept newer non-racist explanations today. So is the author criticizing scholars for having outdated interpretations of past cultural and historical phenomena? Not really. He only mentions this in the context of how they reject geographical explanations saying they are racist. So 3 is not really a criticism of the author, and that should be our exception. Let's look at 4 though. Their rejection of the role of biogeographic factors in social and cultural phenomena. Now there is a mention of one example of biogeographic factors, Aboriginal Australia, where the explanation is biogeographic. But by stating this as a biogeographic example and then continuing to talk about scholars who reject any sort of geographic explanations, the author is criticizing their rejection of biogeographic factors in social and cultural phenomena. That means 4 is a criticism, but 3 is not. 1, 2 and 3 would be criticisms that the author levels against scholars who are not geographers for rejecting geographical explanations, but 3 is not his criticism. So that will end up being our exceptions. Option 3 is our answer. All of the following are advanced by the author as reasons why non-geographers disregard geographic influences on human phenomena except they are. So these are reasons given why non-geographers reject geographic explanations. There are 3 reasons that he gives. The first option here, let's look at this. Lingering impressions of past geographic analysis that were politically offensive. What can be politically offensive? Remember the reference made to racist explanations. So this is given in para 4 that some time back these explanations were seen as racist, and that idea continues, lingering impressions. So is this a reason that the author gives? Yes. So is that our accept? No. Dismissal of explanations that involve geographical causes for human behavior. Now, is this a reason that he gives us as to why non-geographers reject geographic influences or explanations? No, that's not a reason. The author criticizes non-geographers for dismissing any explanation that involves geographical causes. So, this cannot be considered as a reason. He does say that they simply reject all of geographical explanations. And he believes that this widespread but nonsensical view might have several reasons. It's a nonsensical view. So 2 is the author's criticism. That is not the reason that he highlights as to why non-geographers reject geographical explanations. Option 3, belief in the central role of humans unrelated to physical surroundings in influencing phenomena. What can be a central role that humans play, the decisions that they take, which is captured as a reason with the unwarranted importance given for contingency. So historians give a lot of importance to contingency. This can be a central role that humans play by deciding things. So 3 is a reason that he gives for why non-geographers reject all explanations of all geographical explanations. So that's not our accept again. 4. Disciplinary training which typically does not include technical knowledge of geography. This is mentioned in the last paragraph, that the third reason is because they are not technically educated in understanding geographical details. So that disciplinary training misses on technical knowledge of geography. So 1, 3 and 4 you will find are specific reasons that the author gives, the 3 reasons that he gives why non-geographers, scholars that are not geographers, reject any geographical explanation for human phenomena. But 2 is not a cause or a reason, it is simply his criticism of how such people reject geographical causes. So 2 is our exception here. All of the following can be inferred from the passage except. So what cannot be inferred? Now, option 1, several academic studies of human phenomena in the past involve racist interpretations. Can this be inferred? Of course it can. From para 4, where we talk about how geographic explanations advanced a century ago were racist, but there were also many other explanations advanced a century ago that were racist, genetic, historical, psychological, anthropological. That means we can clearly infer that several academic studies of human phenomena in the past involved racist interpretations. Yes, this is not an exception, can be inferred. 2. Individual diktat and contingency were not the causal factors for the use of fur clothing in some very cold climates. That the choice of fur clothing was not because of individual decision making. Is that explained? Yes. Go to para 5. You'll find this example given of the Inuit living north of the Arctic Circle. They did not start wearing warm fur clothes because one influential Inuit leader persuaded others to adopt warm fur clothes. But theirs was a purely geographical and environmental reason. So 2 can also be inferred. 3. Agricultural practices changed drastically in the Australian continent after it was colonized. Yes, para 2 gives us this idea, or gives us the data from which we can infer this. We are told that the crops and domestic animals that now make Australia an exporter are all non-native, and they were brought to Australia by overseas colonists. So yes, agricultural practices changed drastically after it was colonized because the crops were brought in, the colonists brought in certain crops, etc. So 3 can be inferred. 4. While most human phenomena result from culture and individual choice, some have biogeographic origins. Now the problem with this is the word most, which you almost might miss noticing. The point that the author makes is not that most human phenomena come from non-geographic factors. He says at the start itself, many human phenomena and characteristics are influenced both by geographic factors and non-geographic factors. That makes option 4 an incorrect inference. Remember, most is a higher degree than many. Many could mean some, few, but most ends up meaning a percentage closer to all. Therefore, most cannot be considered here. Option 4 is our exception. All 3 can easily be inferred. Here is the easiest of the 4 passages and talks about the complaint, the most recent concern that the residents of Lozère, which is a hilly department in southern France, have. Amongst the several other concerns that most villagers have, familiar to many rural corners of Europe, this particular Lozère, this particular town, has yet another concern, and that concern is the return of wolves. The wolves were eradicated from France last century, but now the predators are creeping back to more forests and hillsides, and they must be controlled, is what people say, particularly because the farmers are worried over their livestock and their livelihoods, because these are predatory wolves that attack their sheep and other animals. The tourists, of course, enjoy visiting a wolf park in Lozère. So the topic clearly is the return of the predatory wolves threatening the grazing animals in Lozère. The argument, among the several concerns common to rural areas in Europe, farmers in Lozère, in southern France, a town in southern France, face another concern, the return of predatory wolves that are a threat to their livestock and their livelihoods. Let's take this ahead. As early as the 9th century, the Royal Office of the Lupari, which is the wolf catcher's office, was created, and this was meant to tackle the predators, control them. They actually completed their job in the 1930s, and you found no wolves at all. They disappeared from the mainland. And they had used a lot of stuff like active hunting, improved technology, like the use of rifles in the 19th century, use of poison, etc. But in the early 1990s, the animals reappeared. They crossed the Alps from Italy, upsetting sheep farmers on the French side of the border. Wolves have since spread to areas such as Lozère, delighting environmentalists because they think that it's a sign of wider ecological health. The ecological balance, the environmental balance is fine. This particular animal species is back again. But farmers who say that the wolves are causing the deaths of thousands of sheep and other grazing animals are unhappy. They're saying that all these environmentalists and politically correct urban types or urban people have allowed the return of an old enemy. So, the Royal Office of the Lupari, wolf catchers, which was created in the 9th century, ensured the disappearance of the wolves from the mainland in the 1930s. But the wolves appeared in the 1990s. Delighting environmentalists, of course, but upsetting the farmers. Now, let's take this ahead. Para 3 talks of the different factors responsible for these changes. What are the different factors? Now, rural depopulation is mentioned as one. What is this depopulation? Now, in Lozère, there was a farming and a once flourishing mining industry, which meant there was a large population of over 140,000 residents living in that town. But that mining industry was once flourishing, meaning it is no longer there. So that means that people have moved out in search of jobs. That's the rural depopulation we're talking about. Then, because humans have come down, the human population has come down, forests are expanding. Now there is more and more forest cover, more fields were given over to trees, no longer farming going on the fields, but these fields have been taken over by trees. Nearly 1/3 of mainland France is covered by woodland of some sort. The second reason is the decline of hunting as a sport, meaning there aren't too many people entering the forests and hunting animals. There were about 2 million hunters in the mid to late 20th century. Now, the national body claims that there are just about 1.1 million people who hold hunting licenses. The mostly protected status of the wolf in Europe is another reason. Hunting them now is forbidden, other than only when some occasional culling of these animals, mass killing for specific reasons, is sanctioned by the state. There is also the efforts of the NGOs. They are very active. They make sure that they track and count the animals. All of this has contributed to the coming back of the wolf population. So we are talking of the different factors here. The return of the wolves is due to factors such as rural depopulation, expansion of forest cover, decline in hunting as a sport, the mostly protected status of the wolf in Europe, and the efforts of NGOs to track and count the animals. Finally, what is our fourth paragraph all about? As the lupine or wolf population of Europe spreads westwards, with occasional reports of wolves seen closer to urban areas, expect to hear of more clashes between farmers and those who celebrate the predator's return. Now, this is only going to be heard of more and more because the wolf population is only increasing. There is going to be more and more of clashes that will happen between farmers and the environmentalists. The environmentalists celebrate the predator's return. Farmers' losses are real, but that's not the only economic story. There are tourist venues such as parks where wolves are kept and where tourists come to see the wolves and the animal spread is discussed. That also generates income and jobs in rural areas. So, there is the losses of the farmer, that is one part of the economic story. The other part of the economic story is that there are gains, there are job generations because of parks where wolves are kept, tourism, etc. So, our final argument of the final paragraph will be, as the wolf population spreads westwards, more clashes between farmers and environmentalists and deliberation between economic losses and gains can be expected. Now, let's put all this together and look at what our main idea is. Fairly simple one, discussion of this return of the predatory wolves and the reasons for it, a bit of history of it, the past, the Lupari, as well as the reasons for it and what might be anticipated in the future. Now, so let's put together our main idea this way. Factors such as rural depopulation, expansion of forest cover, decline in hunting as a sport, the protected status of the wolf in Europe, the efforts of NGOs have led to the return of the predatory wolves in Lozère in southern France, threatening the livestock and the livelihood of its farmers. Environmentalists, however, are delighted. Now, let's take a look at the first question. The inhabitants of Lozère have to grapple with all of the following problems except. So at first glance, this question appears very easy, but there is a slight trickiness in eliminating the options. So what is the exception regarding the problems of the inhabitants of Lozère? Now let's look at para 1, where we have these problems discussed and examine each of the options. Poor rural communication infrastructure. is this a problem that the inhabitants of Lozère have to grapple with? Yes, you can see that's given here. Just like many other villages in France, the residents of Lozère also have these concerns, which is lack of phone and internet connections. That means they have this problem of poor rural communication infrastructure. Lack of educational facilities, yes. Like many other villages, the mayors of Lozère or the residents of Lozère also grumble about a lack of local schools. That's also given. Decline in the number of hunting licenses. Now, this might be a problem because we do know that in the third paragraph, this is stated that the emergence or the return of the predatory wolves is largely because hunting as a sport has come down, and the number of hunting licenses from about 2 million people is now come down to about 1.1 million people. That's mentioned. However, this is not specific to the problems of the inhabitants of Lozère. You will find that this is discussed in the context of the larger country, France. So, it is not specific to the problems that the inhabitants of Lozère have to deal with, which means this can very well be our exception. Let's look at what the fourth one is. Livestock losses. Do they have this problem? Yes. The return of the wolves, the predatory wolves, is a big threat to their livestock and their livelihoods. So, clearly, the inhabitants of Lozère have to also deal with the problem of livestock losses. But the decline in the number of hunting licenses is said in the larger context of discussing hunting as a sport across the country, across Europe indeed, and that's why this is not specific to Lozère. We will consider 3 as the answer. This is actually an easy question, but the question framing makes it sound complicated. The author presents a possible economic solution to an existing issue facing Lozère that takes into account the divergent and competing interests of. So, the moment you see this divergent and competing interests, we do know that there are clashes going on between the farmers and the environmentalists, which is a very straightforward thing. But because the question is quite complicated, you might end up rereading that question framing. So, the entire discussion is about how to solve this existing issue, the predatory wolves threatening the livestock and therefore the livelihoods of the farmers of Lozère. But what are the competing interests being considered? Clearly, we find this in para 2, even in para 1. The environmentalists are delighted, whereas the farmers are not so happy. They're grumbling, they're worried over the loss of their livestock. So, the interests that are divergent will not be the tourists and the environmentalists, not the politicians and the farmers. There is just one politician mentioned in the first paragraph. Environmentalists and politicians, again, not really. Farmers and environmentalists, which is a very, very straightforward case. This should be one really easy question, provided you get through the complicated question framing. Which one of the following has not contributed to the growing wolf population in Lozère? Fairly easy one. Now, we know that this entire discussion of the factors that led to the increased wolf population is discussed in para 3. Let's look at the options. A decline in the rural population of Lozère, this is definitely a reason, very clearly given. Rural depopulation that resulted in forest area expanding. So, 1 is definitely a reason. 2, the granting of a protected status to wolves in Europe. That's also given. The mostly protected status of the wolf in Europe and the NGOs tracking the number and status of the wolves, all of this is an active reason that has contributed to the growing wolf population. So, that can't be our answer. Option 3, the shutting down of the royal office of the Lupari. Now, if we go back to para 2, this is where the official hunters, the office of the Lupari is discussed. These official hunters completed their job in the 1930s after they were created in the 9th century, when the last wolf disappeared from the mainland. So, the job of the royal office was to ensure that there are no wolves around. Now, the shutting down of the office could not have directly and actively contributed to the wolf population growing. The job of the royal office was to ensure that there are no wolves around, which it did, and then it shut down. That doesn't mean that it has actively led to the wolf population comeback. In any case, this is not discussed as a factor in para 3. Now let's look at option 4. An increase in woodlands and forest cover in Lozère. The result of rural depopulation is clearly the expansion of forest land. We are told that a lot of area in mainland France is covered by woodland of some sort. Forests are expanding. So clearly this is a reason that has contributed to the growing wolf population in Lozère. Now, of these options, what has not actively and directly contributed is option 3. So we will consider 1, 2 and 4 as factors discussed in para 3 as active contributors. 3 is not an active contributor. Which one of the following statements, if true, would weaken the author's claims? So here is the loan application question, a slightly difficult one. We will have to very carefully evaluate the options here. Now, what should we be doing here? Weaken the author's claims. Look for anything that the author has not claimed, which contradict or go against the claims that he's made. Let's look at the first option. Unemployment concerns the residents of Lozère. Now, does the author say this, endorse this? Yes, the residents of Lozère, like many other villagers and the residents of many other villages, grumble about several things, which includes a lack of jobs. Therefore, is unemployment a concern for the residents of Lozère? Yes, that's the author's claim. This is not contradicting the author's claim. So can this weaken the author's claims? No. Next, wolf attacks on tourists in Lozère are on the rise. What is the author's take on wolf attacks on tourists in Lozère? Tourists enjoy visiting a wolf park in Lozère, but it's the farmers who worry over their livestock and their livelihoods. The discussion of the wolves and tourists, the interaction between the wolves and tourists in Lozère, is presented in a very positive manner. Tourists enjoy visiting wolf parks. The wolf parks attract a lot of income and jobs, which means wolf attacks on tourists in Lozère are on the rise is not something that the author claims. This could very well contradict the author's claims because he's being positive about it otherwise. Let's keep 2 on hold and look at 3. Having migrated out in the last century, wolves are now returning to Lozère. Are wolves returning to Lozère? Yes, they were eradicated. The wolves had disappeared, but now they are gradually creeping back to more forests and hillsides and Lozère. So this is a true statement that the author makes. He's claiming this. Of course, the only problem here would be having migrated out in the last century. What we are told is that they were eradicated from France. But perhaps, there is a discussion of how they crossed the Alps, etc. And therefore, the word migrated also can be justified. But definitely the second part is what the author claims here. So this cannot be our answer. Option 4. The old mining sites of Lozère are now being used as grazing pastures for sheep. Is this what the author could claim? Let's look at some details. Now in para 3, we are told that there was a large population in Lozère, but the town got depopulated because the flourishing mining industry is no longer there. As humans withdraw, forests are expanding, and in France between 1990 and 2015, forest cover increased. Now nearly 1/3 of mainland France is covered by woodland of some sort. Which means, is it quite possible that the old mining sites of Lozère are being used as grazing pastures? Yes, because even the fields have been given up over to the trees. That's also mentioned. So this is a possibility. And this is something that the author would endorse because more and more woodland and forest cover is seen these days. So the author would agree with this. It's not contradictory to his claims. 1 is not contradictory to the author's claims, 3 is not contradictory, 4 is not contradictory. But because he presents a positive relationship between tourists and wolf parks, saying that wolf attacks on tourists in Lozère are on the rise will definitely weaken his claim, because he is saying that these wolf parks are a source of income and jobs. So 2 of the given options is the best one that can weaken the author's claims by contradicting his stance on the relationship between wolves and tourists. So 2 is our answer. Here is our most difficult passage in terms of the content of the passage as well as the questions. Now this one talks about Marshall Salin's essay that he published in 1972 titled Original Affluent Society, which had apparently had a great impact. What was his argument there? He talked about the hunter-gatherers or foragers societies and said that before their lifestyle was changed by colonial powers, they were not engaged in a desperate struggle for survival. Quite the contrary, they had far less needs. Therefore, they satisfied their needs with far less work than people in modern societies like agricultural societies and then the industrial societies, leaving them more time to use as they wished. Hunters were like bankers and they kept bankers' timings, meaning they worked for very short duration. The so-called Neolithic revolution, rather than improving life, what did it do? It imposed a harsher work regime and set in motion the long history of growing inequality. Now, the Neolithic revolution is a reference to modern societies. So, what is our topic here? The topic will have to be Marshall Salin's essay, the exploration of foragers' way of life in Salin's essay, Original Affluent Society, because it's centered around that essay. What exactly is the point being made by this particular paragraph regarding the essay? It tells us that Salin's main argument in his essay, Original Affluent Society, was that hunter-gatherers or foragers worked far less to satisfy their needs. They had more time for other pursuits, unlike people in agricultural or industrial societies. These societies impose a harsher work regime, and instead of improving life, these societies have given rise to growing inequality in society. Let's examine the next paragraph. Foragers had other options too. It's not like they had no option. They had only the option of working less. The contemporary Hadza of Tanzania, that's an example being given, they'd been surrounded by farmers. So they were aware that they had alternatives, but they rejected the long hours of farmers and farming society. To Salins, this showed that foragers are not simply examples of human diversity or victimhood, but something more profound. And what is this profound thing? They demonstrate that societies make choices. And this is the choice that perhaps is seen in their culture. Now, what is our takeaway from this paragraph? The lives of foragers, the way in which the foragers led their lives, show that societies make real choices and these choices form their culture. And the example given here is the Hadza of Tanzania. Next para. The point of the essay is not so much the empirical validity of the data. So the data is valid, scientifically valid. But the real interest for most readers is not in foragers either today or in the Paleolithic. Not in the foragers who exist today or the foragers who existed in the previous Paleolithic times, but the conceptual challenge that the essay gives to contemporary economic life and the way in which we live our lives. You know, the bourgeois, the middle class mentality, individualism, consumeristic life that we have. So this particular essay is more like a philosophical and political project which tells us that there can be plenty of possibilities that you can imagine, possibilities of living lives, of ways of living life. So with its empirical data, the essay is a conceptual challenge to current day economic life and bourgeois individualism that makes us imagine possibilities. Para 4, with its title Nod Towards the Affluent Society. Now these few sentences might be difficult to understand, so let's look at them carefully. With its titles Nod Towards the Affluent Society, which is John Kenneth Galbraith's famous skeptical portrait of America's post-war prosperity and inequality. So now there is another essay mentioned, Galbraith's Affluent Society. What does Galbraith say in this essay? He criticizes, he's skeptical about America's post-war prosperity with a lot of inequality among people in society, and is filled with the left, new left, or this Marxist contempt for consumerism. And the first few words indicate that Salin's essay makes a reference to the affluent society. So the original affluent society actually agrees with the affluent society. And this essay brought this critical perspective to bear on the contemporary world. So Galbraith had come up with a criticism of the so-called post-war prosperity, inequality, and consumerism. Salin's essay picks this idea and critical perspective and shows it to the contemporary world. How does Salin's essay do this? Through the classic anthropological move of showing that radical alternatives to readers' lives really exist. That there are alternatives. If the capitalist world seeks wealth through greater material production because it has constantly expanding desires, foraging societies follow the Zen road to affluence by not getting more but wanting less. Their road to affluence is seeking less. And affluence here means wealth. If it seems that foragers have been left behind by progress, the essay points out that that's not true. This is because the West has a very ethnocentric way of looking at things. The West believes that it's right. And anyone who's made another choice of a way of living, they are wrong. They've been left behind by progress, according to the West. Rather than accumulate material goods, these societies are guided by other values, and they are leisure, mobility, freedom, etc. So, a very important paragraph with its title referring to Galbraith's The Affluent Society, Salin's essay, through the classic anthropological way, showed the contemporary world Galbraith's critical perspective that societies have alternatives guided by other values than those of the materialistic capitalist world. Let's look at the last paragraph now. Viewed in today's context, of course, not every aspect of the essay has aged well. Now, the author is highlighting a few negative things of this essay. While acknowledging the violence of colonialism, racism, and dispossession, it does not thematize them as heavily as we might do today. So, what is the criticism against this essay given by the author? The author says that it does make a mention of violence that was brought about by colonial practices, racism, dispossession. It does not use them as heavily as we use them today. The second criticism is that while the essay scolds evolutionary anthropologists for treating present-day foragers as left behind by progress. How do present-day anthropologists look at present-day foragers? As people who've been left behind by progress. They have not progressed as much. But the essay also can succumb to the temptation to use them as proxies for the Paleolithic. This is the criticism by the author, that this essay can also make the same mistake. Just like anthropologists are looking at present-day foragers to understand what the Paleolithic foragers might have been like and say that they were not people who progressed. This essay, Marshall Salin's essay, might also be looking at present-day foragers to understand the foragers of the Paleolithic. But no matter what these minor criticisms are, it should not distract us from appreciating Salin's effort. That if we want to think of new possibilities, we need to learn about actually inhabitable worlds. That is, there can be new possibilities that we can come up with of living our lives. So Salin's essay has its limitations in not including the effects of colonialism, racism, and dispossession as we see them today, or as majorly as we use them today, and can be tempted to use present-day foragers as proxies for the Paleolithic. But Salin's effort should be commended for opening new possibilities to us. Let's do a recap and look at what the main idea is. So all of these different paragraphs start with the original affluent society, where Salin's argument is about the foragers and how they worked less because they had less needs. So that shows us that societies can make real choices, and these choices will end up formulating their culture. The essay also has empirical data, but the real value of the essay is that it questions current day economic life and the kind of materialistic individualism that we have and makes us imagine possibilities. The title of Salin's essay makes a reference to Galbraith's affluent society and seems to convey the same point, that critical point that Galbraith makes, to the contemporary world, but he uses a different method. He uses the classic anthropological way, the example of forager societies, etc. There are limitations to Salin's essay, but the effort should still be commended. So what is our main idea? Salin's essay, Original Affluent Society, uses the classic anthropological way to discuss that the forager's choice of working less and wanting less was driven by their values, and shows us the alternatives that exist to the materialist culture of the capitalist world. Let's look at the questions now. This should be an easy question. The author mentions Tanzania's Hadza community to illustrate the point of an example being made, which means you will always have to consider that point in the larger context of the passage. Now, we go back to para 2. This is where the Hadza community is mentioned. Now let's look at the different options. Option 1, that forager communities' lifestyles derived not from ignorance about alternatives, but from their own choice. Now the main point of this passage is that the foragers' communities made a choice of a way of living. And that is where this example is given. The contemporary Hadza of Tanzania, they had long been surrounded by farmers. They knew they had alternatives but rejected them. That showed to Salins that societies make real choices. So this lifestyle that the foragers chose was not because they didn't know the different ways of living, but they chose this way of living. So that should be the main point here, because that also connects with our main idea. Option 2, that hunter-gatherer communities' subsistence level techniques equip them to survive well into contemporary times. Is this the point being made? We're not talking about foragers had certain techniques that made them survive till contemporary times. That is not the focus of the passage at all. The focus of the passage is contrasting the choice of living of the foragers with the living, or that one particular way of living that modern societies have. So 2 cannot be the point here. It doesn't connect with the larger idea. How pre-agrarian societies did not hamper the emergence of more advanced agrarian practices in contiguous communities. While there is a mention made of how Hadza was surrounded by farmers, the point is not about pre-agrarian societies and whether they affected the agrarian practices of communities that lived close to them. 4. How 2 vastly different ways of living and working were able to coexist in proximity. For centuries, coexisting in proximity, different lifestyles coexisting in proximity is also not the point being made. The point being made is very clear. It starts with the first line itself. Moreover, foragers had other options, yet they made the choice of not choosing any other option. So clearly, the point that the author is trying to make in the context of the passage with the example of the Hadza of Tanzania is that forager communities' lifestyles derived not from ignorance about alternatives, but from their own choice. We can infer that Salin's main goal in writing his essay was to, main purpose in writing his essay. Let's examine our main idea again. Why did Salins write this essay and what does it say? Salin's essay, Original Affluent Society, uses the classic anthropological way to discuss that the forager's choice of working and wanting less, was driven by their values and shows us the alternatives that exist to the materialistic culture of the capitalist world. Highlight the fact that while we started off as a fairly contented egalitarian people, we have progressively degenerated into materialism. There is a mention of inequality, rising inequality somewhere in para 1. But that is not really the point that the author is making here. He is not trying to suggest that, yes, we were satisfied equal people or a society of equal people, egalitarian society. But we have progressively degenerated into materialism. The point of this entire essay is to show that we can make a choice of living a life, like the foragers made a choice of living a different life. So one cannot be his main goal. You can see it doesn't sync with the main idea. 2. Hold a mirror to an acquisitive society with examples of other communities that have chosen successfully to be non-materialistic. The other community we are discussing here is the hunter-gatherers or foragers, who chose to be non-materialistic, who chose a way of life where they simply wanted less and therefore worked less for it. Instead, the contrast is with the materialistic culture of the capitalist world. So clearly, this essay holds a mirror to an acquisitive society, a society that only wants to acquire more and more goods and work more and more for it. Clearly captures our main idea, could well be our answer. Let's look at the next one. Of course, there is the reference to all this in para 4 as well. Option 3, put forth the view that despite egalitarian origins, economic progress brings greater inequality and social hierarchies. This is mentioned, as said here earlier, that there is greater inequality that the industrial society or agricultural society brought about. However, as we discussed earlier, this is not Salin's main goal. 4. Counter Galbraith's pessimistic view of the inevitability of a capitalist trajectory for economic growth. Is he trying to counter Galbraith's pessimistic view of the capitalistic trajectory of our society? No, there is no countering. Remember what para 4 says. The title nods toward the affluent society written by Galbraith. Galbraith's perspective, the critical perspective, wherein he criticizes, skeptically examines America's post-war prosperity and consumerism, is brought or highlighted to the contemporary world by Salins, which means he is not trying to counter Galbraith's pessimistic view. He supports it, he complements it, he takes that ahead. So we will end up eliminating options 1, 3 and 4 and consider 2 as Salin's main goal. It very well syncs with our main idea as well. The author of the passage mentions Galbraith's The Affluent Society too. We've already discussed the connection between Galbraith's Affluent Society and Salin's The Original Affluent Society. That's clearly given to us in para 4. Now let's look at the different options. Is he trying to contrast the materialist culture of contemporary growth paths with the pacifist content ways of living among the foragers? You can see that he's not trying to contrast. You can see that the title of his essay nods towards the affluent society, and he tries to highlight the critical perspective that Galbraith presents in his essay to the contemporary world. We just discussed the same idea for our previous question. So it is not contrasting, surely not. That should be eliminated. Is it to show how Salin's views complemented Galbraith's criticism of the consumerism and inequality of contemporary society? The word complement here should be apt, because yes, Salin ended up highlighting that perspective using a different approach, different data, that is the anthropological data, but he does add to whatever Galbraith says. He completes Galbraith's skeptical presentation or questioning of consumerism, modern consumerism. So the word complementing Galbraith's criticism should be an apt purpose here. That's why the author mentions Galbraith's Affluent Society. Let's keep 2 on hold. Show how Galbraith's theories refute Salin's theses on the contentment of pre-hunter-gatherer communities. Clearly not so. They do not refute. Galbraith's views are in sync with Salin's views. Salin's views extend on those or build on those. So clearly incorrect. 4. Document the influence of Galbraith's cynical views on modern consumerism on Salin's analysis of prehistoric societies. Now, is it trying to document? Did the author mention Galbraith's essay to document how his cynical views of modern consumerism have influenced Salin's analysis? Not really. It is not documenting the influence. It just tells us that Salin's views are similar to Galbraith's views, and Salin drove Galbraith's idea to the modern world. So they don't document the influence. That is not the point of the passage, and that is not what this mention of Galbraith's essay does. It only shows us how Salin used anthropological data to show Galbraith's critical perspective to the contemporary world, which means we end up clearly eliminating 1 and 2. The word refute is not right here. And finally 4, there is no documenting of the influence. So 2 ends up being a correct answer. The author of the passage criticizes Salin's essay for its slightly difficult question, but the criticism comes up in the last paragraph. Now, a reading of the last paragraph will tell us that the author is criticizing Salin's essay for 2 things. The first thing for which he criticizes the essay is that it does not use the themes of colonialism, racism, and dispossession as heavily as we use them today. It's very relevant for us in our times, but the author is not using these themes as heavily. The second point on which the author criticizes Salin's essay is that the essay or Salin can succumb to the temptation to use the present-day foragers as proxies for the Paleolithic. That is, Salin can use the present-day foragers to understand the foragers of the Paleolithic. They can be used as proxies for the foragers of the Paleolithic. So this is the second criticism. What this means is that, what this entire sentence, rebuking evolutionary anthropologists, etc., what this means is that the essay does criticize anthropologists for looking at present-day foragers as left behind by progress. They haven't understood the choice that the foragers made. They think that the present-day foragers did not progress and therefore they were left behind by progress, but it was a choice they made. So the essay criticizes anthropologists for it. That's what the essay does. But the author is not criticizing that point. The author simply says that this essay or Salin can also look at present-day foragers to understand the foragers of the Paleolithic. Let's look at the different options now. Critique of anthropologists who disparage the choices of foragers in today's society. We just discussed that this is not why the author criticizes. The essay criticizes anthropologists, but the author does not criticize that point. So we will have to eliminate that. 2. Outdated values regarding present-day foragers versus ancient foraging communities. The author does not criticize the essay for having outdated values regarding present-day foragers and the foragers of the ancient societies. There is no criticism directed to Salin for doing this. Salin doesn't do this. So 2 is not relevant. Failure to supplement its theses with robust empirical data. Now, somewhere in para 3 or so, there is a clear mention of the empirical validity of the data. So the thesis is supported by robust empirical data. That's not a question. The author does not criticize that point. 4. Cursory treatment of the effects of racism and colonialism on societies. Now, this is clearly one of the criticisms. 2 and 3 are easily eliminated by us. 4, we can see, is one of the most important criticisms that is given in the first 2 lines itself. Now, our problem is with option 1. But remember, option 1 is the criticism that the essay does. The essay criticizes the anthropologist. The author does not criticize this point that Salin's essay does. So 1 cannot be our answer. Our answer will end up being option 4. Here is our easier para-completion question. The given sentence says the discovery helps to explain archaeological similarities between the Paleolithic peoples of China, Japan, and the Americas. So there is a discovery we are talking about, explains archaeological similarities between 3 sets of people, which is the Chinese, the Japanese, and the Americans. Now, one quick reading of this paragraph reveals to us that the theme of this paragraph is the discovery of a genetic link between the Native Americans, Japanese, and Chinese that helps explain the cultural similarities too. That's what we understand. Now, if you understand that first sentence, it talks about that unexpected genetic link that was found between Native Americans and Japanese people. Now, can I have the given sentence after this? If I look at the sentence that comes later, it talks about another group branched out from the northern coastal China and traveled to Japan. Now, the given sentence addresses 3 sets of people, China, Japan, and the Americas. I cannot have this sentence in blank 1 because it has not yet talked about the Chinese. That another group branched out from the northern coastal China and traveled to Japan is given later. And therefore, I eliminate option 1 here, blank 1. Now, what comes after blank 2, you find that this ancestral source, which is that group that branched out from northern coastal China, also contributed to the Japanese gene pool, especially to the indigenous natives. That means that we are referring to the Chinese pool that is mentioned in the previous sentence. So is there a logical gap here? No logical gap, which means I can't have the given sentence in blank 2 as well. And obviously, unless we talk about all 3 sets of people, I can't really place a sentence that refers to these 3 sets of people. Now, we've addressed the first 2 groups, Native Americans and Japanese in the first sentence, the Chinese in the next sentence, and how the Chinese, this pool, contributed to the Japanese gene pool. So that connection is established. Now, what does our sentence after 3 say? They shared similarities in how they crafted stemmed projectile points for arrowheads and spears, which means we are talking about how there were archaeological similarities or cultural similarities in how they crafted stemmed projectile points for, different weapons. That means that perhaps my the given sentence can fit in the third blank. Let's hold that and also look at option 4 here, that is blank 4. What comes after blank 4 is this suggests that the Pleistocene connection among the Americas, China, and Japan was not confined to culture but also to genetics. Now, the genetic connection is already explained in the sentence that comes before blank 3. The sentence that comes after blank 3 talks about the similarities in crafting weapons. That means the given sentence should definitely fit in 3 because between the sentences before 4 and after 4, there is no logical gap again. Clearly, our answer should be in blank 3 here and nowhere else. So this is what it looks like, and you are aware that the options were presented in a jumbled fashion. So this is one jumbling. It may have appeared in different ways in different papers, but this is one jumbling option. But our correct answer is blank 3. This para-completion might appear difficult because of the abstract language, but if you pay close attention to the sentence, it contains sufficient clues. The given sentence says that this philosophical cut at one's core beliefs, values, and way of life. So that this philosophical cut at beliefs should be mentioned earlier because you are referring to it as this philosophical cut. The second thing here is you're saying it's difficult enough. So if something is difficult enough, then the point that you are making next logically should be that there is something that is worse. This question is difficult enough, so the next is even worse. There has to be a higher degree that comes later. A quick reading of this paragraph tells you that we are talking of the challenges posed by the experience of reading philosophy. You can figure that out even with a cursory reading. The first 2 sentences tell us that When you start reading philosophy, the values around which one has organized one's life may come to be questioned. They may appear narrow, they may appear wrong, or even evil. And the sentence that comes after that tells us that when the truths you've held, the values that you've held are questioned, then you might have to come up with new values, which means there is no logical gap in one. The two ideas continue. Reading philosophy questions your values. That means you need to come up with new values. Now, what do we have next? What's worse, philosophers admonish or scold each other to remain uncompared until some such time as a defensible new answer is revealed or constructed. What is worse? Why will I want to start with what is worse? All that my previous sentence says is that I need to come up with new ways of living. What's worse? Philosophers ask you not to compare until new answers are arrived at. And then sometimes it is even so critical that it does not provide you with an alternative. It destroys a particular cultural idea or a concept, and then it doesn't give you an answer. So that is the worst part. And what is a given sentence talking about? This cut or this questioning of our core beliefs and values is difficult enough. Now, clearly, the transition of something is difficult enough, but what is worse is captured by the given sentence in 2. We will have to place the given sentence in 2 because that is what best justifies the transition to a higher degree of what's worse. What about 3? Now, there are, questions of no alternative provided, etc. mentioned before 3. But after 3, we are saying that the reader must be prepared for such possibility, and reading philosophy can help one clarify one's values, but it can also sometimes introduce self-doubt. That means that there is no gap in 3. We are talking about a clear transition here. There is absolutely no logical gap. Do we need the given sentence in blank 4? No, because the sentence before blank 4 only tells us about how philosophy can question our self-beliefs, and at the same time it can clarify and confirm certain beliefs of ours. So, where we end up placing the given sentence is in blank 2. That is where it fits well and captures the transition. You're aware that the options were presented in jumbled format. This is one jumbling. It could have varied in different papers. Here, our answer has to be 3. That is where option 2 is mentioned. Though the odd sentence was a surprise appearance, this particular question is not very difficult. Let's look at each of the 5 sentences and give each sentence a label or summarize the key idea of each sentence. So the first sentence talks about how in English there is no systematic rule for the naming of numbers. It's quite unpatterned. So let's make that our label here, no systematic rule for naming numbers in English. The second one talks about how, even more confusingly, some English words invert the numbers they refer to. The word 14 puts 4 first, etc. So more confusions created. Some words, English words, invert numbers that they refer to. Third, it can take children a while to learn all these words and understand that 14 is different from 40. So how the learning process is hampered here because there is no system or systematic way in which numbers are named. Children can take a while to learn these words. So the focus is on children's learning here. 4, for multiples of 10, English speakers switch to a different pattern, 20, 30, 40 and so on. Now once again we are referring to how multiples of 10 are created in English. That has a different pattern. And 5, if you didn't know the word for 11, you would be unable to guess it. You might come up with something like 1 How? You would find it difficult to guess if you didn't really know the word for a number, which means without a proper system and proper rules, guessing can be difficult. You will find that sentences 1, 2, 4 and 5 center around how there are no rules in English for naming numbers, or the irregularity of naming numbers in English. So let's take that as the theme here. Unsystematic ways of naming numbers in English. Now, what is it that stands out here? clearly sentence 3. That's odd here because it focuses on children's learning of these words and how challenging it can be for them. That means clearly our answer here is going to be considered as sentence 3, which is the odd sentence. Now the second odd sentence question is not very easy and needs careful reading. The first sentence talks about appreciating the workings of another person's mind, and that's considered a prerequisite for a lot of other skills that like natural language acquisition, strategic social interaction, reflexive thought, etc. So the focus is on understanding the workings of another person's mind. It's a prerequisite for several things. The second sentence talks about it is a theory of mind, though some scholars prefer to call it mentalizing or mind reading, which is important for the development of one's cognitive abilities. So there is something which is called a theory of mind or mind reading, mentalizing, which is important for the development of one's cognitive abilities. So this is our label to sentence 2. 3. Though we must speculate about its evolutionary origin, we do have indications that the capacity evolved sometime in the last few million years. The capacity, we don't yet know what is the capacity that we are talking about, but what the sentence says is that the capacity evolved sometime in the last few million years. This capacity develops from early beginnings in the first year of life to the adult's fast and effortless understanding of others' thoughts, feelings, and intentions. Now, the capacity mentioned in 3 is also mentioned in 4, and we are told that this capacity develops from the early beginnings of the first year of life. 5. One of the most fascinating human capacities is the ability to perceive and interpret other people's behavior in terms of their mental states. So now this is the capacity that we are talking about. The capacity to perceive and interpret other people's behaviors but in terms of their mental states. So to understand another person's mind and interpret their behavior. So this is the capacity that we are talking about in 3 and 4 again. That means we know clearly that 3, 4 and 5 are connected because all 3 of them talk about this particular capacity of understanding another person's mind. If you consider sentence 1 and 2, you find that 1 also talks about understanding another person's mind. 2 says, 2 refers to a theory of mind and says that it's important for the development of one's cognitive abilities. It's looking at oneself, not looking at reading another's mind. Which means you'll find that sentence 1, 3, 4 and 5 revolve around this capacity of the human mind to perceive and interpret another person's mind, to understand another's state of mind. That will show us that 2 is the odd sentence because it stands out here. It is something that refers to one's cognitive abilities and development of those cognitive abilities and not an understanding of other person's mind. This one requires careful reading, otherwise you can actually miss on the details. So sentence 2 is the odd sentence here. Here's our first parajumble question. Sentence 1, algorithms hosted on the internet are accessed by many. So biases in AI models have resulted in much larger impact, adversely affecting far larger groups of people. Now this one can be a likely starter. It looks like it's introducing something. But what does it say? That there are algorithms that are accessed by many. So the biases in AI models affect large groups of people. Second, though algorithm bias is the popular term, the foundation of such bias is not in algorithms, but in the data, the training data that is fed into the algorithms. So what this talks about is that the algorithms don't contain the bias, it's the training data that contains the bias. But you will notice the use of such bias here. Now the such bias could very well refer to the bias introduced in sentence 1. So biases in AI models have impacted large groups of people, which means this can be connected to 1 and therefore is a follower. 3, talks about their widespread impact, of course, but despite that, it's easier to fix AI biases than human-generated biases, as it's simpler to identify the former than to try and make people unlearn their behavior. Fixing a problem can only come after you talk about what the problem is. In the first place, say that there is a problem, this is the problem, and then we can fix it. It's easier to fix AI biases than human-generated biases. And then there is also that phrase, despite their widespread impact, which means this should follow sentences 1 and 2 clearly. It appears like it is quite conclusive, but we are yet to look at sentence 4. The impact of biased decisions made by humans is localized and geographically confined. But with the advent of AI, the impact of such decisions is spread over a much wider scale. Now, this is what has to be our introductory sentence, because this introduces the entire idea of biased decisions. Decisions made by humans is quite localized, but because AI is accessed by so many people, the impact of biased decisions in AI ends up being much wider and impacts more people. So clearly our starter introduces the topic, and this one clearly connects with 1, because 1 is what talks about why the impact is wider with AI, because many people access the algorithms. That means 4 and 1 should be a sure pair here. And we've also established that 2 and the such bias in 2 refers to 1. So 4, 1 and 2 is a sequence for us so far. Fixing the problem can only come after we've discussed the problem or introduced and talked about the problem, which means 3 should be our concluding sentence. So this appears like our likely sequence here, introducing the entire topic of AI biases that sentence 4 does, explains why the AI biases are or biases in AI models impact larger groups of people, and how the foundation of such bias is not in the algorithm but in the training data that have these persistent biases, and how they can be resolved despite their widespread impact. It's easier to resolve or fix AI biases than fix human biases. So 4, 1, 2, 3 has to be a sequence. Slightly easier parajumble. Sentence 1. What precisely are the unusual elements that make a particular case so attractive to a certain kind of audience? So there are some unusual elements that make a case attractive to some. We don't yet know what the case is all about. This can be a possible starter. It might be a particularly savage, very cruel, or unfathomable level of depravity, morality so low that we cannot understand it, unfathomable. Very often it has something to do with the precise amount of mystery involved. Now you can see that these might be the unusual elements that sentence 1 referred to. So sentence 2 might be answering the question of sentence 1. So there is a link there, and let's call this therefore a follower, because these might be the unusual elements. Unsolved and perhaps unsolvable cases offer something that ordinary murder doesn't. So there are cases that offer something, and they are these unsolvable cases, but ordinary cases, and you can see that ordinary murder is put in inverted commas. There's no such thing as an ordinary murder. Murder is murder. But there are some that have more elements attached to them, and they are unsolvable or unsolved cases. They offer something different. Now, 3 looks like it links with the elements mentioned in 2. We are very clear that 1 is the question raised in 1 is answered in 2, and 3 is continuing that line of thought. Look at 4. Why are some crimes destined for perpetual re-examination and others locked into permanent obscurity? This will have to be our starter, because you can see that this same idea is reiterated in 1. So there are 2 questions, quite rhetorical. You're starting with the idea of there are some crimes that are perpetually re-examined all the time. There are others that are locked, for obscurity. They're forgotten completely, permanently. Why does something like this happen? What are those precise, unusual elements that make some cases more attractive than the others? You can see that 4 and 1 should clearly be a link, because both of them have this rhetoric impact. 2 questions asked one after another. 2 seems to be answering the questions raised, and 3 continues here. 3 ends up extending the idea of 1 and in a way concluding that thought. So 4-1 is a sure pair, 1-2 appears linked, 3 should come at the end. Which means we are looking at a possible 4-1-2-3. Now some of you might wonder, why can't it be 4-1-3-2? Why necessarily 2-3? It's because the link of 1 and 2 is stronger than the link of 1 and 3. The question and the unusual elements part of the question is what 2 seems to address. And that is why 1-2 is a better link. So our sequence here ends up being 4. We start with 4, the rhetorical question in 1 again, 4-1 other questions, 2 appears to address the unusual elements, and finally 3. Our first para summary, the first few lines talk about colonialism not being a modern phenomenon, which means it has existed in the past. And world history is full of examples of one society incorporating adjacent territory, so acquiring close by lands. Then in the 16th century, colonialism changed decisively because of technological developments in navigation. So there was a complete change of colonialism in the 16th century because these technological developments in navigation made it possible for Europeans to move their people far away to different parts of the world and even maintain control over these faraway remote lands. And then finally, we are talking about in the last few lines that the term colonialism is used to describe the process of European settlement, how they dispossessed people from their lands and how they exerted political control or domination over the rest of the world. Now, these are our XYZ points. Let's look at the different options. Colonialism surged in the 16th century due to advancements in navigation, enabling British settlements abroad and global dominance. So does this cover all 3 points X, Y, and Z? Yes. When it says that it surged in the 16th century, it increased, it does imply that it is not a modern phenomenon, it existed in the past. It captures why, that is the advancements in navigation that enabled British settlements abroad and global dominance. However, there is one thing that you'll want to notice. Are we talking only about British settlements here, or is the reference to European colonial projects? So perhaps we need to keep this on hold. If there isn't a better one, we'll come back to option 1. 2. As a result of developments in navigation technology, European colonialism led to the displacement of indigenous populations and global political changes in the 16th century. So the European colonial project is referred to, and how they controlled distant lands, they dispossessed the native populations from their land, etc., is talked about. That there was development in navigation technology in 16th century is also referred to. However, it doesn't imply X, that is that colonialism existed in the past. There is no mention of it, neither does it imply or suggest that. So 2 cannot be our correct option. 3. Technological advancements in navigation in the 16th century transformed colonialism, enabling Europeans to establish settlements and exert political dominance over distant regions. Now, this one clearly covers X, Y, and Z. Particularly, look at the difference created by the use of the words transformed colonialism. We are saying that colonialism changed in form from how it existed earlier, where people only acquired neighboring lands or adjacent lands, and now from the 16th century onwards, how it made possible for people to control remote parts of the world. Now that transformation happened because of the technological advancements in navigation. So 3 is far superior to 1 because there are 2 points in 1 that we don't agree with. One is British settlements, and 2, it surged. Surging is just an increase. It doesn't suggest a change in the entire way in which colonialism could be run. So 3 is far better. Let's also look at 4. Colonialism conceptualized in the 16th century. Now we can stop here and not read the rest of it because it wasn't conceptualized in the 16th century. That's clearly a misrepresentation of the given information. So we end up eliminating all of our options and settling for option 3 because it captures all the important points. Here's our next summary question. Talks about misinformation, manipulating information, which was a feature of history long before modern journalism established rules of integrity. Let's make that our first point here. So, manipulating information existed long before modern journalism brought in rules of integrity. Then there's an example given, that of Octavian, who launched a smear campaign against Antony, his political enemy, and thus became the first Roman emperor. So, in ancient Rome, Octavian launched a smear campaign against Antony to become the Roman emperor. But the 21st century has seen the weaponization of information on an unprecedented scale. Powerful new technology makes the fabrication of content simple, and social networks amplify the falsehoods. But these falsehoods they are peddled by, they are promoted by states, very popular politicians, and dishonest corporate entities. And then the platforms, of course, start this entire business of trolling, and you have troll armies, etc. So that will be our point Z, that in the 21st century, powerful new technology makes it easy for states, politicians, dishonest corporates to create false content and for social platforms to amplify the same. Now let's look at the different options that we have. Use of misinformation for attaining power, a practice that is as old as the Octavian era, is currently fueled by technology. Now we are covering X here, that it existed long before. It was used to attain power, and that's where we go to the Octavian era and how he used a smear campaign against Antony to gain power. And currently in the 21st century, the same use of misinformation by politicians, states, dishonest corporates to gain power is fueled by technology. So X, Y, and Z seem to be well covered in one. Let's hold one and look at the others. Octavian used fake news to manipulate people and attain power and influence just as people do today. Now you can see that this focuses on Y, the example. He used it just as people do today. There is no mention of powerful new technology. There is no mention of how it existed long before modern journalism brought in rules of integrity. In other words, the focus here is Y, point Y, just the example, not the overall point. So it's very easy for us to eliminate option 2. 3. People need to become critical of what they read, since historically weaponization of information has led to corruption. Now this is more of an inference. This is not explicitly stated in the given paragraph and therefore cannot be the summary, because the point of what the author is saying, that is, because there's so much of misinformation being peddled by states, by populist politicians, etc., people need to become critical of what they read. Now that would be an inference that we are arriving at, cannot be our summary per se. So we'll have to keep aside 3 as well. 4. Disinformation, which is mediated by technology today, is not new and has existed since ancient times. Now, despite the difference between misinformation and disinformation, disinformation is also false information peddled or promoted deliberately on purpose, but usually connected with state propaganda, etc. Unlike misinformation, which is false information that is promoted deliberately to deceive people. Now, despite that slight difference, the things that are missing in 4 is the specific reference to the Octavian times. Instead of saying it has existed since ancient times, that it was used to gain power in the early times as old as the Octavian era, and then in the 21st century, how there are politicians who are using it and it's made life easy for such populist politicians and nations. That point is not really covered in 4. In other words, manipulating information to gain power, which is an aspect and which is relevant to the example as well, is not really covered by 4, though it seems to come really close. So what well captures X, Y, Z and becomes an apt summary here will end up being option 1 and not option 4.